This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Since last Tuesday lasted for days, we all get to skip the next few Tuesdays, right? Tonight, the world reacts to a new president-elect, and world leaders congratulate Joe Biden on his election victory. Plus, what to expect from the Biden transition team as it moves towards Inauguration Day and prepares for a new administration. But first, here's what you need to know right now. It's the biggest step toward a vaccine in the US since the outbreak of this pandemic. Pharmaceutical giant Pfizer said today that early results in the COVID-19 vaccine trial shows a 90% success rate in preventing the disease.
90% is a game changer. 90%, now you are hoping to have a tool in your war against this pandemic that could be significantly effective.
Here's a breakdown of what we know. Initially, more than 43,000 people either got this Pfizer vaccine or a placebo version. Of those volunteers, there were 94 confirmed cases of COVID-19. According to the data, less than 10% of the infections were from participants who got the vaccine. Since 2 doses of Pfizer's vaccine were required 28 days apart, they're still monitoring volunteers for a total of 2 months from receiving the second dose. Once that wraps up, Pfizer says it hopes to seek emergency use authorization from the US Food and Drug Administration. That's expected to happen by the 3rd week of November, though mass distribution of a vaccine wouldn't be expected until next year. It's worth noting that Pfizer is not a part of the US government's program Operation Warp Speed. Pfizer put its own funding into vaccine development. Instead, Pfizer did strike a nearly $2 billion deal with the US to provide 100 million doses of the vaccine if it was found to be effective. President-elect Joe Biden is wasting no time preparing to take over as commander-in-chief. Today, he announced his COVID-19 Transition Advisory Board. With help and advice from this group of 13 public health officials, the Biden administration hopes to move the response in a dramatically different direction when they take over in January.
There's a need for bold action to fight this pandemic. We're still facing a very dark winter. The challenge before us right now is still immense and growing. And although we are not in office yet, I'm just laying out what we expect to do.
Typically, newly elected presidents focus on announcing their cabinet first, but this is not a typical year or a typical transition period for a president who says he'll make fighting COVID his #1 priority. Sitting President Donald Trump has yet to publicly concede the White House race, saying he intends to follow through on legal challenges to the results. Of the several lawsuits filed by the Trump team, many of them accuse voter fraud. By now, you've probably heard the fact checks, but it's worth looking back and finding this common theme we've seen from Trump over the years, whenever he suffered a loss at the ballot box. Case in point, these tweets from 2016 in which Trump lost the Iowa caucus in the Republican primary, then accused Senator Ted Cruz of stealing the vote through fraud. Trump also claimed fraud as the reason behind his popular vote loss to Hillary Clinton in 2016, in which his Democratic challenger racked up almost 3 million more votes than Trump, but still lost, of course. In the past week, Trump's legal team has filed roughly a dozen lawsuits claiming a similar situation in the 2020 presidential election.
This is outrageous. An enormously important contest with a very, very suspect method of voting. There was no security. Zero.
The Trump team still hasn't provided evidence of widespread voter fraud, and election officials in key states, many of them run by Republicans, have pushed back on those claims. Legal experts say Trump's chances of legitimately challenging the election are quickly dwindling. Many of the cases were already dismissed. Others that are moving forward are unlikely to change the results of the race. While many world leaders have already weighed in on the presidential election, a select few are holding back on their reactions. Both Vladimir Putin and Mexico's president say they don't plan to weigh in until all legal matters surrounding the election are resolved. Newsy's Ben Shamiso has more.
As supporters of President-elect Joe Biden celebrated his victory in the US, foreign leaders and people around the world expressed hope and relief.
Certains comportements ont été inadmissibles pendant 4 ans. Et je pense que la démocratie gagne beaucoup aux États-Unis et dans le monde.
Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo's tweet, "Welcome back America," summed up the jubilant mood among many Western allies longing for the end of President Trump's disruptive and isolationist foreign policies.
There's almost the feeling of getting a new chance to basically rebuild transatlantic relations.
President Trump often clashed with America's traditional friends, weakening the international liberal order the US helped build after World War II. He also withdrew from major international agreements, such as the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, while pressuring NATO members to chip in more on defense. Looking forward to a Biden administration, America's allies were most cheerful about the prospect of collaborating once more with the US on fighting climate change.
It will put America back in the lead for tackling climate change.
Celebratory messages from world leaders poured in on Saturday and Sunday, many noting the historic achievement of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris.
I congratulate Kamala Harris on being the first female vice president as she will become in the history of the United States.
In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a close ally of President Trump, thanked him for raising US-Israel relations to unprecedented heights and congratulated Biden. Although President Trump has the support of most Israelis for giving the country a series of diplomatic gifts, thousands of demonstrators hailed Biden's victory and called for Netanyahu's resignation. Other world leaders with close relationships to President Trump, such as those of Mexico, Brazil, and Turkey, remained silent. Iran's president called on Biden to return to the 2015 nuclear deal with other world powers. And while leaders of China and Russia stayed quiet, some in those countries cautiously hoped for a new level of cooperation. Ben Shamiso, Newsy.
When you're back, we'll log into Twitter and burn some brain cells together.
We dig a little deeper on the stories of the day to help start making sense of it all.
By now, we've probably all been overserved on Twitter, but what's one more helping? Here's what's trending. The Biden-Harris ticket presented some monumental firsts, but there was at least one biggie that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, in my opinion. Dogs being back in the White House. Joe Biden's German Shepherds, Champ and Major, will bring presidential pets back into the fold. President Trump was the first president in more than a century not to have a pet of any kind. Champ joined the Biden family back in 2008, while Major was adopted from a shelter in 2018. Major isn't the first adopted dog in the White House, though. President Lyndon B. Johnson had a dog that his daughter found at a gas station in Texas. Champ and Major posted to Twitter, "We are the Biden's family puppers and first dogs elects of USA. We want to thank you all for your support by sharing our presidential adventures here." I would go in on them for the corniness, but that's actually pretty good typing for two dogs. RIP to a real one. Much of social media is still weighing in on the loss of Alex Trebek, who died Sunday after battling pancreatic cancer. The Jeopardy host was a familiar face for TV audiences for more than 35 years, which is a lot of time to create memeable material for a younger generation. Things like Alex rapping.
They mad, they ain't famous. They mad, they still nameless. But we still hood famous. Yeah, we still hood famous. I was just getting into this rap thing. I'm not too good at it, but I was getting into it.
Or Alex just dragging this poor woman for no reason.
Fun. It's called nerdcore hip hop. It's people who identify as nerdy, rapping about the things they love, video games, science fiction, having a hard time meeting romantic partners, you know. It's really catchy and fun.
Losers, in other words.
The 80-year-old was still hard at work just over a week ago, pre-taping future shows. Jeopardy says those will continue to air, with the last one slated for Christmas Day. The search for his replacement has not yet started, but it's clear he left a lasting legacy.
I learned English because of you. And so my grandfather, who raised me, I'm gonna get tears right now. I used to sit on his lap and watch you every day. So it's a pretty special moment for me, man.
To be fair, Four Seasons Total Landscaping does kind of sound like a hotel with a well-manicured lawn, but that ain't it. In one of the more confusing episodes from this weekend, Donald Trump noted that his people were having a big press conference at the Four Seasons Total Landscaping Saturday. What followed was a presser helmed by Rudy Giuliani, Trump's personal lawyer, on the backside of a landscaping business, which is situated between a crematorium and a porn shop. According to the New York Times, there was a misunderstanding, clearly, between Trump, Giuliani, and Trump campaign advisor Corey Lewandowski that put them at a small business instead of a hotel. For what it's worth, Four Seasons Total Landscaping has been riding the wave since Saturday. They posted on Facebook saying how they would have hosted any presidential candidate who reached out and thanking people for supporting a small family-owned business. Also, here's how they explain that mix-up in GIF form. It ain't hard to find takes on the election, the good, the bad, and the straight-up ugly. The internet is full of them. But while voters have been especially engaging after the general election results rolled out, one entity has been eerily quiet. Q, the leader of the conspiracy theory QAnon. Newsy's Tyler Atkinson tells us how this has agitated some QAnon supporters and why experts believe Q has gone silent.
Q, the anonymous forum poster behind the QAnon conspiracy theory, went silent after Election Day and has not posted since. QAnon holds wide-ranging beliefs, but the uniting view is that a group of Democrats and celebrities secretly control the government and are responsible for various evils, including child abuse. Q has long stated that President Donald Trump will eventually expose and arrest those involved.
Really, the central figure in QAnon is Trump, in that, he's seen as, this kind of leading hero who, speaks in code and has a plan to overtake this evil satanic cabal. And every slip of the thumb on Twitter or slip of the tongue in a press conference is interpreted as a message to the QAnon followers.
But since President Trump was projected to lose the election, Q has not updated followers about where the theory stands. Q's last post came on Election Day and featured an Abraham Lincoln quote about elections.
A lot of the lead interpreters of Q are saying, trust in the plan, Q is being strategically silent, but he will come back. And so this really comes down to, does Q come back, right? And in what form? And what is the message? Because for now, there is some fracturing.
Some QAnon followers were agitated by the lack of updates from Q, especially as votes were being tallied. Others noted that Q's silence can mean either that the storm hits now, a phrase used by QAnon followers to describe a judgment day led by President Trump against his opponents, or that the plan failed.
There are some people who are panicking about feeling like maybe Trump did lose, feeling like they're searching for their leader to kind of guide them through what happens next.
The lack of centralized QAnon activity has also opened the doors for Q imposters to manipulate those messages too.
Someone took the last Q drop, which was made early on Election Day, and changed the subtitle in order to make this doctored Q drop, so forged Q drop, a call for violence. We haven't seen much traction on this content, which was primarily identified traveling in white supremacist channels.
Moving forward, researchers don't expect that Trump's vacancy from the White House will stop the theory from developing, even if Q doesn't return.
We're at a really uncertain moment about the future of this conspiracy. President Trump is facing multiple lawsuits for a whole slew of issues, everything from rape to tax fraud. And so, when he leaves office, if he ends up being charged for some of these things, that actually is part of the story that QAnon has posed, right? Is that Trump is innocent, but people will try to go after him, right, to protect this cabal.
Tyler Atkinson, Newsy, Chicago.
If you just can't hold it, now's your chance to scoot to the bathroom. I'll see you here after you've washed your hands. You were gonna do that, right? We all know that in most cases, you don't get a new job and just start working right away. You gotta take some steps to get ready for the role. That also goes for the president-elect. Joe Biden has already gotten started with his transition from former VP to POTUS by naming several health officials to his COVID-19 Transition Advisory Board. Newsy's Amber Strong tells us what else is on Biden's to-do list.
The election was called Saturday. The inauguration is January 20th. So what happens in between? Before President-elect Joe Biden gets here, there are a number of steps. In November, the president-elect typically begins announcing his cabinet picks and traditionally meets with the sitting president. Members of his team will also begin meeting with career staff from various government agencies. On December 8th, all state lawsuits and recounts must be resolved. By December 14th, the Electoral College will cast votes. Typically, electors are required to represent the candidate their state picked to be president. On January 6th, Congress will count the votes, and the President of the Senate, Mike Pence, will announce the winner. While the timeline seems smooth, presidential historian and Fight House author Tevi Troy says that wasn't always the case, like in 2000 when the Florida recount shortened the transition timetable.
Bush had a very truncated transition, a very short time, and they didn't seem fully ready. I remember hearing about the first day in the White House. They didn't have the White House phone books available yet, so people, top staffers, didn't know how to reach each other. So they were kind of walking from office to office trying to find their colleagues.
The Pre-Election Presidential Transition Act of 2010 alleviates some of the problems from 2000 by allowing campaign support in the forms of things like office space and computers as soon as a nomination is secured. However, Troy says the peaceful transition from one president to the next goes back to our founding fathers, John Adams and his successor, Thomas Jefferson.
It's an important election, perhaps the most important election in human history, because you had a peaceful transition of power from one party to the other. But I would say that Adams didn't necessarily handle it so well, since he took off and left before the inauguration happened.
This year, the winning campaign has $6.3 million allocated from Congress to spend on the transition. But the General Services Administration, run by Trump nominee Emily Murphy, determines when to release the funds based on when they determine a clear winner. Meanwhile, the Biden team has launched a transition website and says that addressing COVID-19 is among their top priorities. Amber Strong, Newsy, Northern Virginia.
Twitter may not be as hype as it was last week, but if you find yourself doom scrolling through your feed while watching this episode, tweet me your thoughts using the hashtag #NewsyInTheLoop. According to exit polling, Black voters in several key cities helped propel Joe Biden and Kamala Harris past the 270 electoral votes needed to win. Now that the presidential race chapter of this never-ending election season is closing, not over, but closing, Black voters and activists are expecting a wide variety of policy proposals from the president-elect. Newsy's Jamal Andrus has more.
Those moments when this campaign was at its lowest ebb, the African-American community stood up again for me. You've always had my back, and I'll have yours.
President-elect Joe Biden specifically thanked Black Americans during his victory speech in Wilmington, Delaware Saturday night for helping propel him to the White House. He won about 87% of the Black vote, according to exit polls. But what exactly does Joe Biden plan to do for Black Americans once in office? According to the NAACP, like most Americans, the pandemic is the most important issue for Black Americans. The COVID-19 mortality rate for Black Americans is 2 or more times as high as the rate for white Americans. A close second is racial justice, an issue that the Biden-Harris campaign and the country has focused on for months.
I never had to tell my daughter, if she's pulled over, make sure she puts, for a traffic stop, put both hands on top of the wheel and don't reach for the glove box because someone may shoot you. The fact of the matter is, there is institutional racism in America.
These solutions around racial justice and policing are splintered among activists and Black Americans more generally. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump has called for the passing of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which bans chokeholds and no-knock warrants, ends qualified immunity for police, and creates a nationwide use of force standard, among other things. This is a measure that Vice President-elect Kamala Harris has lobbied for and supports.
Right now, the question asked if there is police misconduct and excessive force is to ask of that use of force, was it reasonable? Well, as we all know, we can reason away just about anything. The appropriate and fair question to ask is, was it necessary?
But one step some activists have called for that has been roundly rejected by the Biden-Harris campaign is an effort to defund the police, which means diverting some of the spending for law enforcement to social services.
President Trump says that you want to defund the police. Do you?
No, I don't.
Why would we keep putting taxpayers' hard-earned dollars into a failing system when we could actually put it into a useful and solutionary system that is good for everybody?
Ashley Henderson is an activist from the Movement for Black Lives who worked with U.S. Representatives Ayanna Pressley and Rashida Tlaib on legislation that uses federal dollars to reward cities and counties that defund their police departments. When asked about President-elect Biden's opposition to defunding police, Henderson says her response doesn't change, no matter who's in office.
If it makes it through the House and it makes it through the Senate and it gets to any president's desk and they don't sign it, I would promise that you will continue to see the kind of fervor and rigor of peaceful and passionate and righteously rageful protest in the streets until Black people get what they want.
While President-elect Biden hasn't been in support of defunding measures for law enforcement, he has expressed his support for funding a partnership between law enforcement and social workers to handle mental health emergencies. Jamal Andrus, Newsy, Chicago.
As we said earlier, President-elect Joe Biden has already begun the transition process, naming health experts to his COVID-19 Transition Advisory Board. National reporter Joe St. George takes a look at what might change as the result of who Biden puts in his cabinet.
Now that the victory speech has been given,
The people of this nation have spoken.
the transition begins at Transition 46 launching on Twitter. But who will be in President-elect Joe Biden's cabinet, and how will federal agencies change?
But you should know that President-elect Joe Biden is not beginning this process of who may be in his cabinet. He's actually had a transition team for months who have already been vetting potential prospects.
Senator Chris Coons of Delaware has been mentioned as a possible Secretary of State, as has former National Security Advisor Susan Rice. Whoever is in charge would be tasked with rebuilding relationships with other countries and international organizations. They would be involved in rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization. Over at the Department of Justice, Senator Doug Jones of Alabama or DNC Chair Tom Perez could be Attorney General, a post that will address police reform and this mission from the president-elect.
And root out systemic racism in this country.
Senator Elizabeth Warren has been floated as a possible Treasury Secretary, a department that'll determine the future COVID economic relief payments and whether taxes should be increased on corporations and those making over $400,000. Of course, there will be no greater challenge than dealing with this pandemic, which is why New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham could be the next Health and Human Services Secretary. She used to be in charge of health agencies before entering politics and would be part of a discussion around a national mask mandate. Because of how divided this country is, though, look for possible Republicans to be considered for top jobs, too. Former Ohio Governor John Kasich is a contender, as is former Arizona Senator Jeff Flake. In Washington, I'm Joe St. George.
That's it for us, gang. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back with more in the Loop tomorrow, same time, same place. Top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.